I am Professor Ebenezer Ekefan, and today I'm going to be taking you on the topic for the third day of this training, which is Project and Environmental Compliance Monitoring. This topic is divided into three sections. One, project monitoring, supervision, and reporting. Environmental monitoring and enforcement. Risk assessment and management. The learning outcomes for the first section is expected that we're going to bring you up so you'll be able to define project monitoring and evaluation, develop key questions for monitoring, explain the aims of project supervision, and undertake effective project reporting. While the second section, we expect that you will be able to describe environmental compliance monitoring, describe various types of environmental monitoring, and implement pollution reduction principles. While in the third section, we're going to look at risks, hazards, and risks, and their management. While in section 1, project monitoring, supervision, and reporting. Monitoring is actually an ongoing process to obtain regular feedback on progress being made towards achieving project goals and objectives. While evaluation is a rigorous and independent assessment of either completed or ongoing activities to determine the extent to which they are achieving stated objectives and contributing to decision making. Monitoring provides real-time information, while evaluation provides more in-depth assessment. Key questions that monitoring seeks to answer. 1. Are the pre-identified outputs being produced as planned and efficiently? What are the issues, risks, and challenges that are faced or foreseen that need to be taken into account to ensure the achievement of results? What decisions need to be made concerning changes to the already planned work in subsequent stages? Will the planned and delivered outputs continue to be relevant for the achievement of the envisioned outcomes? Are the outcomes we envisage remaining relevant and effective for achieving the overall national priorities, goals, and impacts? What are the lessons learned? Project supervision essentially draws attention to the environmental and social standards of the World Bank. So project supervision actually wants to see how compliant the project activities are to the various environmental and social standards, the 10 environmental and social standards, and then identify the levels of future environmental and social risk, identify corrective actions that may be needed, and assess local perception of the implementation of project. So all the necessary environmental and social standards are viewed that are relevant to whatever project that that is being supervised or that is being undertaken. I'm going to move other aspects of supervision include institutional requirements, including capacity building and staffing, whether they are in place and are being implemented according to agreed arrangements, including scheduling, whether institutions are taking responsibility or implementing or executing a particular activity. Contract clauses in tender documents are being observed, whether training is being implemented. In case of non-compliance with the plans or outputs, the supervision mission will require a review or amendment of the outputs accompanied by a timetable. Reporting. In all lending operations, the borrower is required to submit periodic reports on the status of implementation of the project financed or co-financed by the World Bank. In each progress report, a section should be dedicated to the status of implementation and monitoring of the environmental and social aspects of the project. Objectives of periodic reporting. Periodic reporting is to ensure the implementation of the project is in line with the World Bank's environmental and social standards, as I earlier stated. Section 2, Environmental Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement. Environmental compliance is ensuring that environmental activities conform to environmental regulations, laws, and standards. Environmental monitoring involves tools and techniques designed to observe an environment, characterize its quality, and establish environmental parameters for the purpose of accurately quantifying the impact an activity may have on an environment. Compliance monitors and ensures that any facility complies with federal or state laws, including regulations, guidelines, directions, and license conditions. Enforcement relates to ensuring any facility or persons follow the laws, the license terms and conditions, regulations, guidelines, and direction. Types of monitoring. 1. Self-monitoring by industry, online or continuous monitoring, discontinuous monitoring. Self-monitoring is done by the industry itself to make sure that relevant emissions and discharges are reported to the authorities, while the online is usually by means of sensors, while discontinued are for emissions which are classified as less critical. The World Bank normally monitors projects that are funded by them in accordance with the environmental and social policy, and making sure that projects comply to the environmental and social commitment plan. Several principles are used for pollution reduction, and they are here discussed. 1, polluters pay principle and pollution reduction tools. In this principle, the polluters bear the cost of measures to reduce pollution according to the extent of either the damage done to society or the exceeding of an acceptable level of pollution. The command and control. Command and control refers to an environmental policy that relies on regulations, permission, prohibition, standard setting, and enforcement, as opposed to financial incentive that is economic instrument of cost internalization. Command and control regulations often work best when emission reduction experience is limited and expertise is concentrated among the regulators. Examples of pollution charges. Several pollution charges are usually made. Pollution charges consist of emission or affluent charges, users charges, product charges, administrative charges. The other principle is cap and trade. Cap and trade is a market-based policy tool for environmental protection. A cap and trade program establishes an aggregate emission cap that specifies the maximum quantity of emissions authorized from sources included in the program. The regulating authority of a cap and trade program creates individual authorization or allowances to emit a specific quantity of a pollutant. The total number of allowances equals the level of the cap. The cap and trade policy works by 1, the regulating authority sets a cap on total mass emission for a group of sources for a fixed compliance period, for example, 1 year. The regulating authority divides the cap into allowances, each representing an authorization to emit a specific quantity of pollutant. The regulating authority distributes the allowances. For the compliance period, each source measured and reports all of its emissions, at the end of the compliance period, each source must surrender allowances to cover the quantity of the pollutant it emitted. The third section now, risk assessment and management. Would start by defining risk. Risk is the chance of harmful effects to human health or to ecological system resulting from exposure to an environmental stressor. The stressor is any physical, chemical, or biological entity, usually referred to as hazards, that can induce an adverse effect in humans or ecosystem. Risks are uncertain events that have the probability to cause losses. The element of uncertainty is present. Risk is the possibility that harm might occur when exposed to hazards. While hazards are sources or situations with a potential for harm to workers or other people on the environment. While risk, like we earlier said, is the likelihood that something bad will happen. Therefore, risk is a combination of likelihood and severity or consequences of a specific hazardous event. While if, for instance, you have a tiger that is inside a cage, the risk is low. But if a tiger, for instance, is released, the risk becomes very high. Like I earlier said, there are 5 types of hazards: physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, mechanical hazards, and psychological hazards. We can see from various, illustrations that are given the different types of hazards, and you can look through to try to figure out what the hazards are while you go through the details of your work. Well, we will try to put us through how to calculate risk. Like I earlier said, risk is likelihood and consequences of severity. Usually there is a likelihood rating and a risk and severity or consequence rating. And if you multiply the risk, the likelihood and the severity, then you have a risk rating which can be used for management decisions. So in consequences rating, we have 5 scales, 1 to 5, with 5 being the catastrophic. And the possible impact of a catastrophic risk is that the risk is probably very high, acute or long-term impacts, likely fatalities and loss of license if a facility is seen to have catastrophic risk. Well, to calculate risk, we have the likelihood versus the consequences. And the risk matrix, where you have green, it shows low risk, so no further mitigation may be required. While where you have the risk falling at the yellow bits, you have medium risk less than 10, further mitigation will be required, will require management action. While where the risk is high is red and is greater than 10, and this is acceptable, immediate management action will be required. We're going to go through types of risk very briefly: human health risk, ecological risk assessment, programs for risk assessment. While human risk assessment consists of 4 different stages: 1, hazard identification; dose response assessment; exposure assessment; risk characterization. While this figure just tries to define the 4 different steps for handling human health risk. The dose response curve tells us that as the log value increases, the response, the biological response also increases. While exposure assessment is the process of measuring or estimating the magnitude, frequency, and duration of human exposure to an agent in the environment, or estimating future exposures for an agent that has not been released. An exposure assessment includes some discussion of the size, nature, and types of human population exposed to the agent, as well as discussion of the uncertainties in the above information. There are several types of exposures, and people can make, or human beings can make, can encounter exposure through inhalation, direct contact, or ingestion. Risk characterization. Well, the objective is to summarize and integrate information from the preceding steps of the risk assessment to synthesize an overall conclusion about risk and provide the likelihood of any of the adverse effects occurring to people who are exposed. We have then ecological risk assessment. Ecological risk assessment involves planning of an ecological assessment, and this is the initial phase of ecological initial phase. Given some overlap with the concurrent human health risk assessment, planning of both can occur together. Ecological risk assessment also informs an environmental damage assessment in which losses of ecological services, for example, flood protection, fishable water, will be valued monetarily. The risk assessment purpose determines who participates in the planning. The product of planning and ecological risk assessment includes definition of the management goals, management options to be evaluated, and the overall scope and complexity of the risk assessment. Problem formulation, which is the second part of ecological risk assessment. The purpose is to specify the exact assessment endpoints, methods, and data that will be evaluated. And then analysis of exposure and effects. Then risk characterization. The objective of risk characterization is to use this result of analysis to estimate the risk posed to the ecological assessment endpoints. The assessment should describe the overall risk, indicate the overall degree of confidence in the risk estimates, summarize uncertainties, cite evidence supporting exposure, stressor response, and risk estimates, interpret the adversity of ecological effects. While the last point for us in assessment is the program/project risk assessment. And this usually defines the exposure, what type of hazards might a project experience, and to what extent, potential impact, given the exposure to hazards, what are the potential impacts on the physical aspect of the project designed. And then adaptive capacity. How will the non-physical components and the broader development context modulate the potential impacts on specific aspects of the project? And then project risk, usually based on the previous steps, what is the overall risk from climate and geographical hazards on the project? We will end our presentation here, and I hope that we'll have the details in the materials that have been posted for you to go through. Go through them carefully, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. Thank you very much for your patience.